I never imagined I would be shoved face first into a three-tier cake in front of 300 employees and investors at my son's year-end party. Frosting covered my suit as laughter spread through the ballroom. My daughter-in-law pointed at me and smirked. This is what failure looks like. I struggled to stand, but my son grabbed the microphone and said, "Old man, you're too shabby to be here. You don't belong among successful people." The room fell silent. I wiped the frosting from my face and smiled, because they had just made their biggest mistake. I'm so grateful you're here with me today, truly. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world are you watching from. Your city, your state, your country, I want to know. Every single location means the world to me. A small note. This story weaves fictional elements into its heart for storytelling and reflection. Names and places are coincidental, but everything it teaches you is worth keeping. The last thing I expected on the evening of December 19th was to end up face down in a three-tiered buttercream cake in front of 300 people. But that's exactly where I found myself at 7:45 that Friday night, inside the Grand Meridian Hotel's main ballroom in Columbus, Ohio. Hands buried wrist-deep in white frosting, the Mercer and Associates logo dissolving against my left cheek, and every chandelier in the room blazing down on me like I was the featured exhibit at a museum nobody asked to visit. 300 people watched it happen. I know because when I pushed myself up slowly, deliberately, the way a man learns to do everything at 71, I could see all of them. The men in their dark, tailored suits, the women with champagne flutes suspended halfway to their lips, the junior associates near the back who didn't know whether to laugh or look away. And above it all, the enormous LED screen mounted over the stage still broadcasting every second of it in crisp high definition, because whoever ran the production crew for my son's party had done their job a little too well that evening. 300 people. Not one of them moved toward me. My left knee throbbed from where it had struck the stage edge on the way down. The frosting was cold and heavy against my fingers, soaking through the fabric of my jacket, the charcoal tweed I'd bought at JCPenney back in 2003, the one Eleanor picked off the rack herself and declared distinguished. She'd made me try it on twice before she was satisfied, standing in the men's section, with her head tilted to one side, deciding whether my shoulders sat right. I was thinking about Eleanor, and the way she'd smoothed the lapels with both hands and said, "Yes, that's the one," when Donovan's voice came through the microphone. "Are you serious right now?" I looked up. My son stood at the podium at the far end of the stage. He was 43 years old and wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first car. His hair styled his watch, catching the light with every small movement. The face I had watched grow from infant to toddler, to a boy who once cried for 20 solid minutes because he dropped his ice cream cone on the 4th of July, that face was carrying an expression I didn't fully recognize. Not concern, not embarrassment on my behalf, something considerably colder than either. He stepped away from the podium and toward the edge of the stage, and his voice dropped just slightly, the way it does when he's aiming for controlled and not quite landing it. "You're too shabby to be sitting here, old man." He said it clearly, precisely, like a man who had rehearsed the words, or at least had thought them so many times that speaking them aloud required no particular effort. "Why would you bring that pathetic appearance to my party?" The room went so quiet I could hear the ventilation system running overhead. Somewhere to my left came a small, strangled sound, quickly swallowed, barely audible, and without looking, I knew it came from Piper, my granddaughter. 10 years old, and already better at holding herself together than most grown adults I'd encountered, but not quite able to manage that one. My chest cracked clean down the middle at the sound of it, not from what Donovan had said to me, from what he'd made her hear. I did not look at Piper. I didn't want her to see my face in that particular moment, because I wasn't entirely certain what was on it. What I did instead was reach into my jacket pocket and pull out a handkerchief. White cotton worn soft at the fold lines with two initials embroidered in pale blue thread in the corner. E.M. Eleanor Mercer. She'd had a set of 6 made for me the year we celebrated our 30th anniversary. This was the last surviving one, and I had been carrying it every day for reasons I'd never needed to explain to anyone. I wiped my hands. I took my time doing it. Methodical. Thorough. The way I used to clean my drafting tools at the end of a long day on a construction site, because a man's tools deserve to be treated with care, and some habits become indistinguishable from character after enough years. From somewhere behind me near the tables where Donovan's investors and partners had spent the last hour drinking his wine and congratulating themselves on their association with his success, I heard someone exhale a short, sharp sound. Not quite a laugh. Something worse. The kind of noise a person makes when they've decided that another man's dignity is less important than their own amusement. Donovan gestured at the ruined cake at me at the general situation. "Can someone get this cleaned up?" He was talking to the waitstaff. He was talking about me. I finished wiping my hands. Then I stood up. It took a moment longer than it once would have. My knee expressed its objection in terms that were impossible to misinterpret. But I got there straightening to my full 6 feet 1 inch, same as it had always been, same as the morning I signed my first construction contract at 26, and I looked at my son across the length of that stage. Donovan Mercer, my son, standing in front of 300 people who believed because he had told them in keynote speeches and magazine interviews and charity dinner remarks that he had built everything around them from nothing, with his own hands. Alone. I looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that several people near the front shifted in their seats. Long enough that something flickered across Donovan's face just once, just briefly, before the cold expression locked back into place. "Good," I said. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "Now I know exactly where you stand, son." I turned and walked off that stage, not quickly. Not the hurried exit of a man fleeing humiliation. The measured, deliberate pace of someone who has simply determined that a particular room no longer requires his presence. I kept my spine straight, my chin level, and I did not glance up at the LED screen, even though I could feel it above me still running, still recording every step I took. Near the far end of the ballroom, a young man in a waiter's uniform held the service door open without being asked. I walked through it without breaking stride. The door swung shut behind me. The noise of the ballroom, the low murmur beginning to replace the silence, the careful resumption of conversation, the distant clink of someone reaching for a glass, reduced itself to a muffled vibration on the other side of a wall. I stood alone in the service hallway. My heart was knocking against my ribs hard enough that I was aware of it, which I attributed to anger rather than grief, because one of those felt considerably more manageable than the other. The hallway smelled like dish soap and industrial cleaner. Honest smells, working smells, the kind I had spent the better part of my adult life surrounded by. I looked down at Eleanor's handkerchief still folded in my right hand. I unfolded it once, then folded it back. Then I reached into my pocket, took out my phone, cracked screen, upper right corner, a casualty of a parking lot in November of last year that I'd never gotten around to fixing, and dialed the one number I kept for situations that genuinely required it. Fletcher Grady picked up on the second ring. "Fletch," I said quietly, "it's time." 24 hours before I found myself on the floor of that ballroom, I was standing at my kitchen window on Callaway Street in Dayton, Ohio, watching the first gray light of Thursday morning work its way across Eleanor's hydrangea bushes. It was the 18th of December, not yet 6 in the morning, and the coffee maker on my counter was making its usual sound, that particular off-key gurgling it had developed sometime around 2019, which Eleanor would have replaced immediately, and which I had never once considered fixing. She had no patience for appliances that performed their basic function while simultaneously complaining about it. That was her phrase, and she applied it equally to kitchen equipment and to people who showed up to neighborhood meetings just to hear themselves talk. But Eleanor had been gone for 10 years, so the coffee maker stayed. I filled my thermos and stood at the window. The hydrangeas were stripped bare in December, just dark sticks rising out of frozen ground, the same bushes she had planted herself one weekend in 1994 when I was working a job in Cincinnati and couldn't talk her out of it over the phone. In June, they were enormous and slightly unruly and exactly right. Now they looked like what they were, a garden holding its breath for a season that hadn't come yet. I had my coffee. I had my quiet. I had her hydrangeas outside the window and a photograph above the toaster of Donovan at his college graduation. 22 years old, an arm around each of us, all three squinting into the June sun. It was a Thursday morning in December, and it was enough. My phone buzzed on the kitchen table at 6:03. Piper. I knew before I picked it up, not through any particular logic, just the accumulated weight of 71 years pressing pattern into instinct. I answered, and sure enough, her voice came through in a whisper, slightly breathless, the kind that tells you a person has been awake for a while before they made the call. Grandpa. A beat. Are you actually coming tonight? Your dad invited me, I said, settling into the kitchen chair with the uneven leg I'd shimmed with folded cardboard back in 2021 and never properly fixed. Of course I'm coming. There was a pause. Not the distracted pause of a child with something more interesting happening nearby, the deliberate pause of someone choosing their words with more care than a 10-year-old ought to need. Grandpa, she said, quieter now. You should be careful tonight, okay? My hand tightened slightly around the thermos. Careful how, sweetheart? Another pause longer than the first. Then a sound in the background, footsteps or a door, and Piper's voice shifted into something breezier, the practiced lightness of a child resuming a performance that had been briefly interrupted. Nothing, she said. I just meant it's cold out. The weather app says there might be ice on I-70, so drive safe, okay? I'll drive safe, I told her. You go eat something before school. She said she would. She hung up. I sat with my thermos and thought about the pause. Not the explanation she'd given, the pause underneath it. The one that came before the cover story. Piper was 10 years old, which meant she was old enough to know something was wrong and young enough not to have the tools to say it plainly. My chest tightened thinking about what she might be carrying around in that small rib cage of hers, whatever it was she hadn't been able to tell me. You should be careful tonight. Kids picked up anxiety from the adults around them, the way clothes picked up cigarette smoke, completely invisibly, without consent. That's what I told myself. Ambient worry absorbed from a household where the air probably ran a little thin sometimes. That's all it was. I almost convinced myself. After breakfast, eggs, scrambled toast, the last of the orange juice, I went upstairs. The suit was hanging on the back of the bedroom door where I'd put it the night before. Charcoal tweed, narrow lapels slightly worn at both cuffs, a small repair at the right elbow from where I'd caught it on a fence post in the winter of 2022. Neat enough that you had to look for it. Eleanor would have spotted it from across the room, commented on it, and then told me I looked fine anyway. I stood in front of the closet mirror. Not bad for 71, I said. I always said it to her. 8 years later, and I still did. It was one of those habits that had outlasted the person it was built around, like the coffee maker, like the hydrangeas, like the chair with the shimmied leg. She would have snorted and said something about the tie, then picked a different one and been right. I chose the burgundy one, the kind of choice I believed she'd approve of, and got it squared up on the first try, which felt like a good sign. Downstairs, I packed the thermos and found my keys on the hook by the back door. Before I left, I stood in the kitchen one more moment looking at the room. The coffee maker, the hydrangeas through the glass, the graduation photograph above the toaster. Donovan, at 22, with that particular expression I had spent years trying to name exactly: pride, yes, and relief, but underneath both of those something almost desperate. The look of a young man who has wanted something fiercely for a long time, and has finally gotten his hands on it, but hasn't yet worked out what it costs. I touched the edge of the frame, then I pulled on my coat, clicked off the light, and went out to the garage. The 1998 Ford F-150 sat waiting in the cold, dark green rear bumper, dented from a parking lot encounter in 2017, 187,000 miles on the odometer. It started on the first turn the way it always did, because I had maintained it the way my father taught me, which was simply the way you maintained anything you intended to keep. The drive down Interstate 70 to Columbus took an hour and 20 minutes through flat, gray Ohio farmland. The sky, the particular blank white of December, without any actual intention of snowing. I drank my coffee. I listened to a country station for a while, then a talk show I turned off after 10 minutes. Then the comfortable static between stations that happens when you're between towns and between thoughts. Somewhere past London, Ohio, with 30 miles left to Columbus, and the sky beginning to darken at the edges the way it did by 4:30 in December, I stopped thinking about Piper's Pause and started thinking about the folder in the bottom drawer of my desk back on Callaway Street. The one Fletcher Grady had put together 30 years ago and told me to keep somewhere safe and tell no one about, not because anything in it was shameful, but because some documents only do their job correctly when nobody knows they exist until the exact moment they're needed. I had read through it the previous evening after Piper's call. I hadn't needed to read it closely. I knew every page. I just needed to remind myself that it was there. The Columbus skyline appeared through the windshield glass towers, catching the last light. Everything polished and vertical and expensive looking. I found a street parking spot 2 blocks from the Grand Meridian, killed the engine, and sat listening to the truck tick as it cooled down. "Be careful tonight, Grandpa." I opened the door and stepped out into the December cold, pulling my coat collar up against the wind coming off the street. The hotel entrance was visible from where I stood, tall glass doors, a uniformed doorman, warm amber light spilling out onto the sidewalk. Inside, 300 people were already gathered to celebrate my son's success. I picked up my thermos from the passenger seat, locked the truck, and walked toward the light. The invitation didn't come from my son. I want to be clear about that, because the sequence of events matters. It was the evening of Tuesday, November 25th. 3 weeks before the party, before the cake, before everything. And I was sitting in the living room on Callaway Street with the television off and a cup of cooling coffee on the end table beside me, doing what I did most evenings since Eleanor passed, existing quietly in a house built for 2. My phone rang. I looked at the screen and felt something shift in my chest, not warmth exactly, more like the ghost of warmth, the memory of what it felt like when that name used to appear regularly. Serena Whitmore Mercer, my daughter-in-law. We spoke perhaps 4 times a year, and 3 of those were holidays where the call lasted under 6 minutes. I answered anyway. "August." Her voice came through bright and warm, the particular warmth of someone who has practiced the tone in advance. "I'm so glad I caught you." "Serena," I said. "Everything all right?" "Everything's wonderful." A small laugh polished at the edges. "I'm actually calling about something exciting. Donovan's year-end party is coming up December 19th at the Grand Meridian in Columbus. It's going to be a beautiful evening. Investors, partners, the whole team. And we both really want you there." I set my coffee cup down carefully on the end table. "We both want me there," I repeated. "Of course." Not a flicker of hesitation. It was Donovan's idea, actually. He felt it was important to have family present. You know how much these milestone events mean to him. I knew Serena Whitmore Mercer well enough to recognize the difference between a sentence she believed and a sentence she had constructed. This was the second kind, assembled, cleanly delivered smoothly, but carrying the faint mechanical quality of something that had been rehearsed until the rough edges wore off. My stomach turned over once quietly, and I kept my voice easy. "That's thoughtful of him," I said. "What time should I be there?" She gave me the details: 7 o'clock, black tie, optional valet parking available. She mentioned the hotel's reputation, the caliber of the guest list, the importance of the occasion. She said it would mean so much to Donovan. She said it 3 times in 4 different ways, which was 2 times more than a true thing usually needed to be said. "I'll be there," I told her. "Wonderful." The warmth in her voice dialed up another degree, the way a performer's smile widens at the sound of applause. "We're so looking forward to it, August. It really will be a special night." She hung up before I could ask anything else. I sat with the dead phone in my hand for a long moment, listening to the house around me, the refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen, the wind pressing against the bedroom window upstairs, the particular silence of a place that has been lived in for decades and knows how to hold a person's thoughts without comment. Then I called Donovan. He answered on the 4th ring, and I could hear traffic in the background voices, the compressed busyness of a man in the middle of something that mattered more than his phone. "Hey, Dad." Clipped, distracted, the voice he used when he was present in body only. "Serena just called," I said, "about the party." A pause, brief, almost imperceptible. "Right. Yeah. You should come. Was it your idea to invite me?" Another pause, this one a half-second longer than the first. My heart squeezed painfully in my chest, waiting for the answer, because I already knew what the truth sounded like coming from Donovan, and I already knew this wasn't going to be it. "Sure," he said. "Of course, it'll be good to have you there." "Sure. Of course." The words of a man confirming a dentist appointment, not inviting his father to the most important professional event of his year. My jaw tightened. I breathed through it. "I'll drive up," I said. "Don't worry about arranging anything for me." "Okay." More traffic sounds. "Listen, Dad, can we talk later this week?" "Go ahead," I said. "I'll see you on the 19th. He hung up. I held the phone against my knee and stared at the wall across the room, the one with the framed photograph of the 3 of us at Donovan's college graduation, all squinting into the June light. He was 22 in that picture. He still called me every Sunday back then. He still laughed at my jokes, even the bad ones. I pushed myself up from the armchair, my knees registering their usual complaint about the process, and walked down the hallway to my study. The room was small and cluttered in the comfortable way of a space that gets used rather than displayed. Engineering textbooks I hadn't opened in a decade. A corkboard with old receipts and business cards pinned to it. A drafting table Eleanor had always called an eyesore, and I had always called essential. And at the bottom of the oak desk in the lowest drawer, a manila folder held shut with a rubber band that had been there so long it had fused partially to the paper. I sat down, opened the drawer, and took it out. Fletcher Grady had put this together in 2009, organized it, notarized it, filed the appropriate documentation with the state of Ohio, and then handed me the copy with instructions that were simple and absolute. Keep it somewhere safe. Tell no one. You'll know when it's needed. I had never needed it. Year after year, I had hoped I would never need it. I turned the pages slowly, not reading, I knew every word, but running my thumb along the edges the way you might handle something that has waited patiently for a very long time. My eyes moved over the figures, the dates, the language that Fletcher had chosen with the precision of a man who understood that the difference between protected and unprotected was often a single clause buried in the 3rd paragraph of a document no one expected to matter. Outside, the November wind pushed through the bare branches of the oak tree in the front yard, and the house creaked once softly, the way old houses do when the temperature drops. It was Donovan's idea, actually. I closed the folder, snapped the rubber band back into place, put it in the drawer, and pushed it shut. Serena Whitmore Mercer had called me on a Tuesday evening in late November with a rehearsed voice and a story that didn't quite fit together at the seams. And something in the pit of my stomach, the part of me that had spent 35 years reading structural blueprints and learning to identify the exact point where a load-bearing wall was hiding a problem, that part told me the invitation wasn't an invitation at all. I just didn't know yet what it actually was. I've read the phrase self-made man applied to my son in 3 separate business publications over the past 4 years. The first time I was sitting at the kitchen table with my morning coffee, and I read the sentence twice, then set the magazine face down on the table and went out to water Eleanor's hydrangeas, even though it wasn't the right time of year for it. The second time I was in Fletcher Grady's waiting room, and I put the magazine back on the stack without finishing the article. The third time I tore the page out, folded it carefully, and put it in the folder in my bottom drawer, not out of anger, but because a man should keep accurate records of the stories being told about his life, even the ones that get the facts wrong. Donovan Mercer did not build his company from nothing. He built it from $340,000 of his father's retirement savings, 35 years of engineering contacts, and a phone call I made on his behalf to a man named Prescott Dalloway on a cold afternoon in February of 2012. Let me tell you how it actually started. It was the spring of 2009, and Donovan was 27 years old and had just been laid off from the commercial real estate firm where he'd worked for 4 years. The financial crisis had taken the job cleanly, no severance, no warning, just a cardboard box and a handshake from a manager who looked like he might be next. He showed up at my door on a Saturday morning with a manila envelope under his arm and shadows under his eyes, and something in his expression that I recognized immediately because I had worn it myself at 27, the look of a man whose entire plan has just stopped working and who isn't sure he has another one. "Dad." His voice came out rougher than he intended, and he cleared his throat hard. I need to show you something." "Come in," I said. "Sit down, I'll get coffee." He spread the papers across the kitchen table, hand-drawn charts, market research printed from the internet, a 12-page business plan he'd clearly been working on for months, maybe longer. His hands shook slightly as he arranged the pages, and he kept glancing up at me and then back down the way he used to as a kid when he wasn't sure I was going to like what he had to say. "Real estate development," I said, reading the cover page. "Commercial and mixed use," he said quickly. "I know the market looks terrible right now, but that's actually the point. Distressed properties, undervalued assets, if we move now while everybody else is scared." He stopped himself, swallowed. "I mean, if I move now." I looked at my son across the kitchen table. 27 years old, 2 weeks unemployed, hands still trembling slightly over a business plan he'd built in secret because he wasn't sure I'd believe in it. My throat tightened so fast I had to take a sip of coffee to cover it. "How much do you need?" I asked. Donovan blinked. "Dad, I haven't even finished explaining the—" "How much?" He named a figure. $340,000, his estimate for seed capital, covering the first 18 months of operating costs, initial property acquisitions, and legal setup fees. He said it carefully, watching my face clearly braced for the conversation to go sideways. I nodded slowly, doing the math I had already done a dozen times in the previous 10 seconds. "Give me a week," I said. "I need to talk to Fletcher." Donovan's mouth opened. "Fletcher Grady, Dad, why would you need your—" "Because if I'm going to invest my retirement in your company," I said, "I'm going to do it correctly." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds, and then Donovan's eyes went red at the rims, and he looked away at the window jaw, working, trying to get himself back under control. He was not entirely successful. My own chest felt like something large and heavy was sitting on it, but in the way that large, heavy things sometimes feel when they're exactly where they're supposed to be. Fletcher Grady had been my attorney since 1994, when he helped Eleanor and me refinance the house on Callaway Street. He was 68 years old now, sharp as a man half his age, and constitutionally incapable of doing anything halfway. When I called him and explained what I wanted, investment structured through a private family trust, controlling interest, retained Donovan to have full operational authority, without knowing the extent of my ownership stake. Fletcher went quiet for a long moment. "You want to protect him," Fletcher said, "but you also want to protect yourself. I want to protect both of us from a version of this where it goes wrong, and nobody has any recourse," I said. "That's the same thing," Fletcher said. "Give me 10 days. The trust structure Fletcher built was elegant in its simplicity. Capital flowed in through layered holding entities, my controlling 51% interest, documented and secured at the trust level, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look or what to ask. Donovan saw the investment as what I told him it was his father believing in him enough to write a very large check, which was also true. Both things were true simultaneously. That's the thing about structures, they don't change the meaning of what's inside them. By February of 2012, Mercer and Associates had 3 completed projects and a reputation that was growing faster than Donovan's operating capital could comfortably support. He needed a major partner, someone with deep pockets and deeper connections, someone who could open doors that stayed closed to a 30-year-old developer with 3 years of track record. I called Prescott Dalloway on a Thursday afternoon. Prescott was a former Ohio State Senator who had spent 20 years in Columbus building relationships, and another 10 years after leaving office turning those relationships into a second career as a private investor. We had known each other since the late 90s when I'd served as chief engineer on a public works project his office had overseen. We weren't friends exactly, our lives didn't overlap enough for friendship, but we trusted each other, which in my experience is considerably more durable. "I'm calling about my son's company," I told him. "I think it's worth your time to look at." "Tell me about your son," Prescott said. I told him the truth, not the polished version, not the business magazine version, but the actual version, a young man who had built something real from a difficult starting point, who had made smart decisions under pressure, who had the capacity to build something much larger if he had the right support. I told Prescott that I believed in Donovan, the way I believed in sound engineering, not blindly, but based on evidence. Prescott met with Donovan the following month. By April, he had committed to a significant investment partnership. He never told Donovan about my call. I never told Donovan either, because what Donovan needed, what I understood even then, perhaps especially then, was to believe that he had earned it himself. And he had earned it. He had done the work, made the decisions, built the relationships. The phone call I made to Prescott was not the thing that made Donovan successful. His own effort did that. I just made sure the door was open when he arrived at it. By 2015, Mercer and Associates had 40 employees, 7 figures in annual revenue, and a reputation that was beginning to attract attention beyond Ohio. And that was the year Donovan attended a networking event in Columbus and came home talking about a woman named Serena Whitmore, who worked in corporate acquisitions and had gone to Dartmouth and had a laugh that he described as the kind that made a whole room look up. Eleanor was still alive then, just barely, and I remember sitting beside her hospital bed the following Sunday when Donovan brought Serena to meet her for the first time. Eleanor held Serena's hand and said she was lovely, which was true, and that she hoped Donovan was happy, which was also true. After Serena and Donovan stepped out to get coffee from the hospital cafeteria, Eleanor turned her head on the pillow and looked at me with those eyes that had always seen things I couldn't articulate yet. "August," she said quietly, "watch over him." Her voice had gone thin by then, papery, in a way that still made something wrench behind my sternum when I thought about it too directly. I took her hand in both of mine and held on. "Always," I told her. "You know I will." She passed 3 months later on a Tuesday morning in March, with the Ohio light coming gray through the hospital window, and my hand still in hers. Donovan sat on her other side and cried in a way I had not seen from him, since he was a small boy, open, unguarded, without any attempt at composure, and I thought watching him that grief at least had not changed him. That whatever else the years and the success and the money had done to the man my son was becoming, the part of him that knew how to love was still there. I held on to that thought for a long time afterward, longer probably than the evidence warranted. Columbus, at 7:15 on a Friday evening in December, smelled like money and exhaust fumes, and the particular kind of ambition that only exists in cities that are still trying to prove something about themselves. I had parked the F-152 blocks from the Grand Meridian and walked the rest of the way with my thermos tucked under my arm and my collar turned up against the wind coming off High Street. The hotel entrance materialized out of the dark ahead of me. Tall glass doors framed in brushed steel, a uniformed doorman standing at attention. Beneath a heated awning, warm amber light spilling out onto the sidewalk in a way that was clearly engineered to make you feel like you were arriving somewhere important. I had helped build 3 hotels in this city over the course of my career. None of them had looked like this. The doorman pulled the door open without being asked which was his job, and I nodded my thanks and stepped into the lobby. The heat hit me first, that aggressively comfortable temperature that expensive hotels maintain year-round, the kind that makes December feel like a rumor. Then the smell, fresh flowers, leather furniture, something faintly citrus that was almost certainly pumped through the ventilation system by a company that charged considerably more per month than my property taxes. The lobby floor was pale marble. The chandelier overhead was the size of a small aircraft. At the reception desk, 2 women in matching blazers were managing a line of guests with the brisk efficiency of air traffic controllers. I walked toward the ballroom entrance and felt the first pair of eyes find me, a young man in a hotel uniform near the coat check, who tracked me from the door to the hallway with the particular expression of someone trying to determine whether I was a guest or a problem. I was wearing the charcoal tweed. I was carrying a scratched thermos. I was 71 years old, and I was not wearing a watch that cost 4 figures. He had clearly arrived at a preliminary conclusion. "Sir," he stepped forward, "are you here for the Mercer event?" "I'm August Mercer," I said, Donovan's father, something recalibrated behind his eyes. "Of course, Mr. Mercer. Let me just one moment. August." The voice came from my left, and it was perfectly timed, the kind of timing that requires either excellent instincts or advanced preparation. Serena Whitmore Mercer came toward me across the lobby marble in a floor-length gown the color of deep water. Dark hair pinned up with the precision of someone who had spent considerable time and money achieving the appearance of effortlessness. She was, objectively speaking, a striking woman. She had always been a striking woman. That had never been the issue. She took both my hands in hers and squeezed them with warm pressure, her smile wide and genuine-looking, from any angle beyond arm's length. "We're so glad you made it all the way from Dayton," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach the coat check attendant and the couple near the elevator and anyone else in the lobby who happened to be paying attention. All the way from Dayton. 75 miles on a straight interstate in good weather conditions. She made it sound like I had crossed a mountain range on foot. "Wouldn't have missed it," I said. "Come on." She tucked her hand around my arm, not the way a daughter-in-law escorts a family member, but the way a handler moves a prop into position. "Everyone's already inside. Donovan will be so happy you're here." She steered me toward the ballroom entrance, and I noted with the professional attention of a man who had spent decades reading the intentional geometry of constructed spaces that she chose the route that led directly through the widest section of the lobby, past the most people, and into the ballroom through the main doors rather than the side entrance that would have been faster and quieter and considerably less visible. I noted it. I filed it. I kept walking. The ballroom was enormous and loud and lit by chandeliers that turned everything gold. 300 people filled the room in clusters, Mercer and Associates employees, with their lanyards and nervous laughter investors, and partners in their dark suits, talking at a volume calibrated to sound relaxed. The kind of well-dressed crowd that only assembles when someone is simultaneously celebrating success and trying to create more of it. On the far side of the room, elevated on a platform stage, was the cake. 3 tiers, white frosting the Mercer and Associates logo rendered in gold. In the center of the stage, a podium. Above the stage, an LED screen the size of a highway billboard currently displaying a looping reel of company highlights. At stage right, a second camera on a tripod crew, positioning. I assumed for the evening's remarks. I found Piper almost immediately. She had always been easy for me to locate in any room, something about the particular way she held herself that my eyes recognized before my brain did. She was sitting at a round table near the left wall in a navy dress that was clearly new, her hair in a ponytail that had already started listing to one side. The moment she saw me, her whole face lit up with the unguarded joy that children produce before they learn to moderate it for audiences. She started to stand. Serena's hand tightened slightly on my arm, just slightly. A pressure adjustment so small it could have been unintentional, and she angled us both toward the stage. "Donovan's going to want to introduce you to a few people before the remarks start," she said brightly. "Very important night for him." I looked back at Piper. She had settled back into her chair, watching us with those dark eyes that missed considerably less than most adults gave her credit for. Her mouth formed 2 words silent across the noise of the room. "I'm sorry." My chest ached looking at her. 10 years old and apologizing for things that were not remotely her fault. "Serena," I said, "I'd like to say hello to my granddaughter first." Of course, in just a moment." She patted my arm. "Come meet Richard Calloway first. He's one of our biggest investors, and he specifically mentioned wanting to meet Donovan's family. You know how important these relationships are." I let her steer me. Not because I couldn't resist, but because I was paying attention to the route she was choosing, to the angle of approach toward the stage, to the fact that she had positioned us to walk along the left side of the stage where the cake sat at the far end. I spotted Donovan near the podium talking with a group of men in suits, his posture doing the specific thing it did when he was performing confidence rather than experiencing it, shoulders slightly too square, laugh, half a beat too quick. He saw me from across the stage. His smile didn't drop. It didn't exactly stay either. What it did was become effortful in a way that only I would recognize after 43 years of watching that face. He gave me a small nod. 1 degree of acknowledgement. The kind you give someone whose presence you have accepted but not sought. My throat tightened. I nodded back. Serena was still talking something about the guest list, the evening's agenda, the remarks Donovan had prepared. Her voice was warm and continuous, and I was listening to approximately none of it because I was watching where her feet were going. We reached the edge of the stage. The cake was directly to my right, enormous and white and immaculate. The LED screen above was cycling through its highlight reel construction projects, ribbon cuttings, Donovan, shaking hands with men in expensive offices. Serena half turned toward me as if to say something, and her left foot moved outward, not backward, not sideways, but forward and outward at precisely the angle that would intersect with my next step. And then the floor disappeared. The service hallway behind the Grand Meridian's ballroom smelled like industrial dish soap, and the particular honest sweat of people doing actual work line cooks and bussers and dishwashers moving through their Friday night with the efficient rhythm of people who don't have time to pretend about anything. It was 8:05 by the time I found a spot against the wall that was out of the main foot traffic, roughly 20 minutes after I had pushed myself up off that stage floor, with white frosting on my hands and 300 people watching. My left knee was announcing its grievances in terms that were impossible to ignore. The back of my suit jacket felt stiff and cold, where the frosting had soaked through the fabric. A young man appeared at my elbow, maybe 20, 22, in the black and white of the hotel service staff, with a stack of paper napkins held out toward me without ceremony or fanfare. His name tag read Marco. "Here, sir," he said simply. I looked at him. Brown eyes, a small scar above his left eyebrow, the expression of someone who had decided to perform one specific act of decency and was seeing it through regardless of whether it was technically his job. "Thank you, Marco," I said. He nodded once the way people nod when they've done what they came to do and moved on. I watched him go and felt something loosen very slightly in my chest, not much, but enough to remind me that the evening had not yet dissolved all the way to the bottom. I used the napkins on my hands first, then on the worst of the jacket damage, which was substantial and more or less irreversible without professional cleaning. The charcoal tweed had been through a lot in 22 years. This was going to be its most memorable ordeal. Through the narrow gap between the service door and its frame, I could see a slice of the ballroom, the edge of the stage, the lower half of the LED screen. The back rows of guests who had resumed the performance of enjoying themselves with the practiced determination of people who had paid too much for this evening to let a scene involving an old man and a dessert ruin it entirely. I could see Donovan. He was back at the podium, or near it, talking to a man in a charcoal suit. His posture rebuilt into its performance configuration, his hands moving with the measured confidence of someone steering a conversation back toward safe water. Whatever had happened 20 minutes ago was already being processed as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a wound to sit with. My son. My boy. My chest didn't crack this time. It just ached, the low and persistent ache of something that had been hurting for a long time and had simply stopped surprising me. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket. The cracked screen lit up 8:07. Eleanor's handkerchief was still in my left hand, folded back into a rough approximation of its original shape. I smoothed it against my knee once. Then I found Fletcher Grady's number and pressed call. He answered before the second ring completed. "Gus." His voice was exactly what it always was, unhurried. Precise, the voice of a man who had learned decades ago that urgency and clarity were not the same thing, and that the second was considerably more useful than the first. "Tell me." "She tripped me," I said. Deliberately, in front of the full room. Donovan was at the microphone. I kept my voice level. "He didn't help me up, Fletch. He told me I was too shabby to be there." A beat of quiet on the line. Not the quiet of shock. Fletcher Grady did not shock easily, but the quiet of a man absorbing information and cross-referencing it against everything he already knew. "Are you hurt?" he asked first. "Knees angry, nothing structural." "Good." A pause. "Gus, are you certain about what you saw with Serena?" My jaw tightened. "I'm a structural engineer, Fletcher. I spent 35 years reading the physics of how things fall. That foot did not move by accident." Another brief quiet. Then, "All right. Are you ready to move forward?" I looked through the gap in the service door at Donovan reconstructing himself at the podium, and I thought about Eleanor's last instruction, "Watch over him," and I thought about what watching over someone actually meant when the person in question had arrived at a place where your presence was classified as a liability. "I've been ready for 3 weeks," I said, "since Serena called." Fletcher's voice shifted, not in tone exactly, but in register, the subtle change of a gear engaging. "I'll need 45 minutes to make the necessary calls. Vivian is already aware of the situation in general terms. I'll bring her current, and we'll come to you." "Vivian Ashworth," I said, confirming. "She drove up from Cincinnati this afternoon," Fletcher said. "I told her there was a reasonable chance the evening would require board intervention. We both hoped I was wrong." That stopped me. Vivian Ashworth, the independent chairwoman of Mercer and Associates Board of Directors, a woman I had met twice in person and spoken with perhaps 6 times by phone, a woman whose professional reputation in Ohio corporate governance was the kind that made lawyers straighten their ties before returning. Her calls had driven up from Cincinnati on a Friday afternoon in December because Fletcher Grady had told her I might need her. My eyes went hot unexpectedly. Not from grief, not exactly. From the particular overwhelming sensation of realizing that people have been quietly standing by you for longer than you knew. Tell her I said thank you, I managed. Tell her yourself in 45 minutes, Fletcher said. Find somewhere to sit, Gus. You've been on your feet long enough. He hung up with the efficiency of a man who had a significant number of calls to make in a limited amount of time. I lowered the phone and stood in the service hallway, with the dish soap smell and the kitchen noise and Marco's paper napkins in my hand. 45 minutes. I found a plastic chair near the hallway wall, the kind that existed in every back-of-house in every hotel and restaurant in America, functional and entirely without pretense. And I sat down in my cake-stained suit and I waited. The service door swung open and shut as kitchen staff moved through. Somebody dropped a sheet pan somewhere deeper in the kitchen, and the clatter rang off the tile walls. The jazz band on the other side of the ballroom wall started up something slow and wandering, and I could feel the bass notes in my sternum. "Well, Ellie," I said quietly to the empty hallway, "you told me to watch over him. I'm trying to figure out if this is what that looks like." The kitchen noise continued around me. The jazz band played on. And then the service door opened, and someone small slipped through. She found me the way she always found me, without announcement, without fanfare. As if locating me in any room on earth was simply something she had been born knowing how to do. The service door pushed open at 8:20, and Piper Mercer came through it sideways, one shoulder leading the way. Kids enter spaces they're not entirely sure they're allowed to be in. Her navy dress had a smear of something white near the hem, frosting, I realized, from the stage, and her ponytail had given up any pretense of staying centered, listing hard to the left. She had one shoe slightly untied. She saw me and her whole body exhaled. "Grandpa?" She crossed the hallway in 4 quick steps and wrapped both arms around my midsection and held on with the particular fierce grip of a child who has been frightened and is not yet ready to let go of the thing that reassures her. I put my arms around her and held on right back, and for a moment neither of us said anything, because some reunions don't need an opening statement. She smelled like the hotel's fancy hand soap, and faintly like the strawberry shampoo she'd been using since she was 6. I felt something unknot in my chest that I hadn't fully realized was knotted. "Hey, sweetheart," I said into the top of her head. "How'd you get back here?" She pulled back far enough to look up at me, her dark eyes moving immediately to the frosting damage on my jacket. Her face crumpled at the edges, not crying, not quite, but the expression of someone working very hard at the border of it. "I told the waiter near the side door that I felt sick and needed air," she said, which wasn't entirely a lie. A beat. "Are you okay? Does your knee hurt? I saw you hit the stage." "My knee's been through worse," I said. "Sit down with me for a minute." We settled onto the plastic chairs against the wall, Piper pulling hers close enough that our shoulders touched, and she folded her hands in her lap with a formality that looked borrowed from adults she'd observed a 10-year-old's impression of someone preparing to say something serious. "Grandpa," she said, "it wasn't an accident." My chest tightened sharply. "Tell me what you know," I said carefully. "All of it." Piper took a breath. Then she looked down at her folded hands and spoke the way she always spoke when she was being precise about something, evenly, without rushing, with the particular carefulness of someone who understood that the details mattered. "2 weeks ago," she said, "I came home early from school because we had a half day. Dad was at the office. I went upstairs to get my tablet, and I heard Mom on the phone in the study. The door wasn't all the way closed." She paused. I know I shouldn't have listened, but her voice sounded wrong, like tighter than normal, like when she's really concentrating on something. "What did she say?" I kept my voice even. "She said..." Piper's brow furrowed as she pulled the words up from memory. "She said, He needs to look incompetent, unstable. One bad night in public is all we need, and then the documentation practically writes itself. And then she listened for a bit, and then she said, "The party is perfect. Everyone who matters will be there. Just make sure your end is handled." The words landed in my stomach like cold water. "Did she say who she was talking to?" I asked. Piper shook her head. "I didn't hear a name. But after she hung up, she was on her laptop for a long time. And she had this—" Piper hesitated, her face troubled. "She had this expression, like when she wins something. You know that specific face." I knew that face. I had seen it exactly once before across a dinner table when a business competitor of Donovan's had announced publicly that he was closing his firm. Serena had smiled at that news, the way people smile when something confirms what they always knew would happen. "Piper." I turned to look at her directly. "Why didn't you tell me this when you called yesterday morning?" Her eyes went wet at the corners, not spilling over, just sheening the specific moisture of guilt and helplessness combined. "I tried," she said. "I said be careful, but I couldn't. I didn't know how to say the rest of it without—" Her voice wobbled and she pressed her lips together hard, steadying herself. "I didn't want to scare you, and I thought maybe I'd heard it wrong. And I thought maybe if I hoped hard enough it wouldn't happen anyway." My throat closed completely for a moment. 10 years old. She had been carrying this alone for 2 weeks, hoping she was wrong. Hoping her 10-year-old wish would be enough to prevent what she'd already understood was coming. I took both her hands in mine. They were cold. She'd come through the December lobby without stopping for her coat. "You did exactly right," I said. "Both times. You warned me this morning, and you told me the rest of it tonight. That took real courage, sweetheart." Her chin was trembling now, tiny and determined. "Is it bad, Grandpa?" "What's going to happen?" "Some things are going to change," I said honestly. "But the people who love each other, that part doesn't change. That's not up for negotiation." I squeezed her hands. "You understand me." She nodded, a small, emphatic dip of her head. Then she leaned sideways and put her head against my shoulder, and I felt the tension in her slowly begin to release degree by degree, the way a building settles after a storm. We sat like that for a while. The kitchen noise moving around us, someone in the back calling out an order number, the ventilation system humming its steady note overhead. "Grandpa," Piper said finally, her voice muffled by my jacket. "Dad used to be different, didn't he? When I was really little." The question hit me somewhere behind the sternum. "Yeah," I said quietly. "He was." "What happened?" I thought about how to answer that honestly, in a way a 10-year-old could hold without breaking. "He got scared," I said finally. "And when some people get very scared for a very long time, they start making decisions that feel like protection, but are actually just walls." Piper absorbed that. "Walls keep things out," she said slowly, "but they also keep things in." I looked down at the top of her head. 71 years old, and my granddaughter had just explained something I'd been working out in my chest for nearly a decade. "That's exactly right," I said. She sat up straight and wiped the corners of her eyes quickly with the back of her hand, fast, efficient, like someone filing away emotion for later. "Okay," she said, squaring her small shoulders. "What do I do?" "Go back to your table," I told her. "Act normal. Don't let your mother know you came back here." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Can I do anything else?" "You already did the most important thing," I said. "You told me the truth." I stood up carefully, the knee reiterating its position on the matter, and walked her to the service door. "I'll handle the rest." Piper looked up at me one more time, her expression cycling through several things quickly before landing on something that looked like trust. Not the unquestioning trust of a very young child, but the deliberate trust of someone who has assessed the situation and made a decision. "Okay," she said. "But Grandpa—" "Yeah, don't let them win." She slipped back through the service door before I could respond, and it swung shut behind her with a soft click that echoed in the hallway longer than it should have. I checked my watch. 8:32. Fletcher had said 45 minutes from 8:07. 13 minutes remained. I went back to my chair and sat down, turning Eleanor's handkerchief over in my hands. Don't let them win. 31 years of practicing law, and Fletcher had never put it that cleanly. I heard him before he came through the door. It was 8:35, I know, because I had been watching the minutes move on my watch, with the focused attention of a man waiting for a very specific thing to happen. And the sound that preceded Donovan into the service hallway was one I would have recognized anywhere, that particular clearing of his throat, low and deliberate, that he had been doing since he was 15 years old and needed a moment to compose himself before saying something difficult. Some habits survive everything, even success, even distance, even 15 years of someone telling you that the person you used to be is someone to be ashamed of. The door opened and Donovan stepped in. He had loosened his tie, barely just the top button of his collar undone, and his jacket sat slightly wrong on his shoulders, in the way expensive suits do when the person wearing them is carrying tension in places the tailor didn't account for. He looked both ways down the hallway, with the darting eyes of someone who had asked a staff member where his father went, and was not entirely pleased with the answer. He found me in my plastic chair against the wall, and something moved across his face: relief, irritation, guilt, calculation, cycling through fast enough that I couldn't have said with certainty which one won. "Dad?" He walked toward me, keeping his voice down despite the kitchen noise that would have swallowed a normal conversation easily. "What are you still doing back here?" "Waiting," I said. He stopped a few feet away, hands going into his trouser pockets, a gesture I recognized as his version of steadying himself. "Waiting for what?" "For the next part of the evening," I said. Donovan's jaw worked briefly. He glanced down the hallway back at me. "Look," he said, "what happened out there, it wasn't supposed to go like that." I looked at my son steadily. "Which part?" He pulled one hand from his pocket and pressed it through his hair. "The cake. The scene. That wasn't the plan." "What was the plan, Donovan?" The question landed, and he shifted his weight, and I watched him do the calculation behind his eyes, how much to admit, how much to manage, where the boundary was between honesty and exposure. He had always been good at that calculation. He had gotten considerably better at it over the years. "The plan was for tonight to go smoothly," he said carefully. "Investors, partners, good impressions. You know how important this kind of event is." "I do," I said. "I helped build the company that makes this kind of event possible. So yes, I understand the importance." His face tightened. "That's not fair." "I'm not trying to be unfair," I said. "I'm trying to have an honest conversation. Those aren't the same thing." Donovan pulled his other hand from his pocket and crossed his arms, a different gesture. Defensive, the posture of a man who has decided the best offense is a fortified position. "I need you to come back inside, Dad. People are asking questions. It looks bad." My heart squeezed with a quick, sharp pain. Not from anger, from the precision of the phrase. It looks bad. Not, "I'm worried about you." Not, "I'm sorry for what I said." It looks bad. "What kind of questions are they asking?" I said. "About you." He dropped his voice further. "About who you are. Why you were here. Some of the investors, they haven't met you before, and after what happened." "After what you said," I said quietly. He stopped. The words sat between us in the industrial air of the service hallway, and Donovan had enough decency left to not argue the point directly. "After the situation," he said instead, which was a retreat dressed as a revision. "It created an impression that I need to manage. If you come back in, have a drink, talk to a few people, it smooths things over." He looked at me with an expression that was trying to be reasonable and landing closer to pleading. "That's all I'm asking, Dad. 1 hour. Then you can go home." "Oh, then you can go home." The sentence of a man who has decided that his father's presence is a problem to be solved rather than a relationship to be tended. I thought about the 27-year-old who had sat at my kitchen table with shaking hands and a business plan he'd been afraid to show me. I thought about Eleanor in her hospital bed, saying, "Watch over him." I thought about Piper's voice in this same hallway 20 minutes ago, "Don't let them win," and the 2 weeks of worry she'd been carrying alone in her 10-year-old chest. "Donovan," I said, and something in my tone made him go very still. "Do you know why I came tonight?" He blinked. "Because Serena, not because of Serena." I kept my voice level and quiet. "I came because you're my son. Because I have driven 450 miles in the past 2 months, just hoping you'd pick up the phone when I called. Because your daughter whispers warnings to me at 6 in the morning, because she's frightened of something she doesn't have the words for yet." My voice stayed steady, but my hands pressed together hard in my lap, knuckles going pale. "I didn't come here to smooth anything over. I came because I love you, and that turns out to have been a very different reason than why I was invited." Donovan's arms uncrossed. His face did something complicated and painful, guilt surfacing through the management layer, breaking through in the specific places where the armor hadn't fully set. "Dad," he started. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Once. Twice. I glanced down at the screen. "Fletcher." I looked back up at my son, at this man who had once fallen asleep on my shoulder on long drives home and told his second-grade class that his dad could build anything. And I made a decision that felt like closing a door very gently on something that had been open too long in the cold. "Go back to your guests, Donovan," I said quietly. "Someone will come find you soon enough." He stood there for a moment, his mouth slightly open, searching my face for something, reassurance maybe, or a way back to the version of this conversation where he was still the one managing the situation. He didn't find it. He turned and pushed back through the service door without another word, and the door swung closed, and I was alone again in the hallway, with Fletcher's name lit up on my cracked screen, and the sound of the jazz band starting a new song on the other side of the wall. I answered the call. "They're here, Gus," Fletcher said. "Lobby, 2 minutes." I stood up from the plastic chair for the last time, smoothed the front of my cake-stained jacket with both hands, and walked toward the ballroom. Before I tell you who just walked through that hotel door and changed everything, comment "stay" right now so I know you're still with me. Because what happens next is the part nobody in that ballroom saw coming. A heads up, the story ahead contains some fictional elements built for storytelling and reflection. If that's not for you, it's completely okay to step away, no hard feelings at all. Fletcher Grady had been my attorney for 31 years, and in all that time I had never once seen him hurry. He walked into the Grand Meridian's lobby at 8:52 that Friday evening, the same way he walked into every room I had ever seen him enter, with the measured, unhurried confidence of a man who had already read the ending and found it satisfactory. 72 years old, silver hair combed back with military precision, a charcoal suit that had cost real money, and wore it without announcing it. He carried his leather briefcase in his left hand, the same dark brown case he had owned since the 90s, refurbished twice because Fletcher believed that quality things deserved to be maintained rather than replaced. Behind him, a step to his right, was Vivian Ashworth. I had met Vivian in person exactly twice. Both times were brief, professional, and conducted in conference rooms with other people present. What I remembered from those meetings was this: she was the kind of woman who made other people aware of their posture without doing anything in particular to cause it. 55 years old, dark hair shot through with silver at the temples, wearing a black suit that was tailored to within a millimeter of intention. No jewelry except small pearl earrings. She moved with the specific economy of motion of someone who had learned long ago that every unnecessary gesture was a dilution of presence. She was, as of 18 months ago, the independent chairwoman of Mercer and Associates Board of Directors, a position that carried under Ohio corporate law and the company's own governing documents. the authority to convene emergency board sessions, demand financial disclosures, and in cases of documented misconduct, recommend suspension of executive authority pending review. She had taken the role because Fletcher had recommended her and because Gus Mercer had quietly approved the appointment without Donovan ever understanding why his father had an opinion about board composition. The two hotel staff members at the concierge desk straightened almost imperceptibly when Vivian came through the doors. People always did. She had that particular quality. Fletcher reached me first and gripped my hand firm, brief the handshake of a man assessing the situation through the contact. His eyes went immediately to the frosting on my jacket, and something in his jaw tightened. "She did it," he said. "Not a question." "In front of the full room," I confirmed. Stage camera was running. Fletcher's expression didn't change, but his grip on the briefcase adjusted slightly. "Good," he said, which was a Fletcher-Grady word that covered a considerable range of meaning. Vivian stepped forward and extended her hand. "Mr. Mercer." Her voice was measured and warm in the specific way of someone who had learned to carry both qualities simultaneously without letting either undermine the other. "I'm sorry for the circumstances. I'm glad you called. I appreciate you making the drive," I said. "Fletcher was persuasive," she said with a small, precise smile, "and the situation warranted it." She glanced toward the ballroom entrance, then back to me. "Are you prepared to proceed?" "I've been prepared for 3 weeks," I said, "since Serena called." Vivienne nodded once, the nod of someone filing information, rather than reacting to it. Fletcher briefed me on the trust structure and the board authority question. "I've reviewed the relevant documentation. The path forward is clear, provided you've made your decision." "I have." "Then let's go in." Fletcher opened his briefcase and removed a folder, thick-tabbed, organized with the thoroughness that was simply how he operated. He handed me the top document briefly, so I could confirm the date and signature. Everything in order. Everything it had always been waiting patiently in the bottom drawer of my desk on Calloway Street. For the evening, it would finally be needed. I handed it back and we turned toward the ballroom. That was when I saw Serena. She was standing near the ballroom entrance, or had been, because the moment her eyes found our small group crossing the lobby toward her, something happened to her face that I had never seen on it before. Not the social displeasure she deployed like a tool, not the thin-lipped patience she used on occasions she found beneath her. This was something raw. Her gaze moved from me to Fletcher's briefcase to Vivian's face, and I watched the recognition travel through her, the specific physical recognition of a person who has just understood that the situation has changed in a way they did not plan for. She turned and disappeared through the ballroom doors at a pace that was not quite running, but had made that decision in advance. "She's going to warn Donovan," I said. "Let her," Fletcher said without breaking stride. "It won't change anything." Vivian glanced at me sidelong as we walked. "How are you holding up, Mr. Mercer?" The question surprised me not because it was inappropriate, but because it was genuine, and genuine questions from people I barely knew had a way of catching me off guard. My eyes went briefly hot, and I blinked it back hard. "I've had better Friday evenings," I said. The corner of her mouth moved. "After tonight," she said, "you'll have considerably more of them." We reached the ballroom doors. Through the glass panels I could see the room, the chandeliers, the clusters of guests, the stage with its ruined cake that someone had partially cleaned away. Donovan was visible near the podium, and even through the glass I could see the shift in his posture as Serena reached him, leaned close, said something that made his shoulders go rigid. Fletcher put his hand on the door. "Ready," he said. I straightened my jacket, the cake-stained 30-year-old charcoal tweed that Eleanor had chosen off a rack in JCPenney, and declared distinguished, and I looked at the room full of people who had watched my son tell me I was too shabby to sit among them. "Open the door, Fletch," I said. There is a moment in every large room when the air pressure shifts, when enough people notice something is wrong, that the whole atmosphere adjusts like the drop before a storm rolls in off Lake Erie. I felt it the second Fletcher pushed those ballroom doors open, and the three of us walked through. It started at the edges. A junior associate near the entrance glanced up, clocked Vivian's face, and went very still. The woman next to him noticed his reaction and turned to look. The turning spread not quickly, not dramatically, but with the particular inevitability of a room full of people trained to read the entrance of anyone who might matter to their professional futures. The jazz band, to their credit, kept playing, but even they lost a little confidence in the next 8 bars. "Stay close," Fletcher said quietly, which was more direction than he typically offered. Vivienne moved with us, but slightly ahead, not leading exactly more the way a ship's prow moves through water, creating the space we needed to cross the room. Staff members stepped back as she passed. A senior manager near the bar actually put down his drink. I kept my eyes forward and my spine straight, and I did not look at the LED screen, which I could see in my peripheral vision, had switched from the highlight reel to a static display of the company logo. Someone had made a quiet decision about what to broadcast after the earlier incident. Donovan broke from the group near the podium and came toward us with his jaw set and his eyes doing a rapid assessment of the 3-person formation crossing his ballroom floor. Serena remained where she was, one hand pressed flat against the base of her throat, a gesture I had never seen from her before, and that told me more about her internal state than anything she could have said. "Dad?" Donovan planted himself in our path, dropping his voice to a register designed to contain the conversation. "What is this? Who are these people?" "You know Fletcher," I said. Donovan's eyes cut to my attorney with barely concealed alarm. "Why is your lawyer here?" Vivienne stepped forward before I could answer, extending her hand with the smooth precision of someone who had executed this particular maneuver many times in many rooms. "Good evening, Mr. Mercer. I'm Vivian Ashworth. I believe we've spoken by phone on 2 occasions, most recently in September, regarding the Q3 board review." Donovan shook her hand reflexively, the way people shake hands when they're still processing whether they should. "Ms. Ashworth." His voice shifted a half-register tighter. "I didn't know you were going to be here tonight. I drove up from Cincinnati this afternoon," she said pleasantly. "At Mr. Grady's request, in my capacity as independent board chairwoman." A brief pause calibrated to land. "I hope that's not inconvenient." Donovan's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, alarm, the beginning of anger, then the managed smoothness of a man who had trained himself to perform composure in high-stakes rooms. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said. "Tonight is a company social event, not a board matter. I don't see why—" "Donovan!" The voice came from the right side of the room, unhurried and carrying easily over the ambient noise of 300 people pretending not to stare. Prescott Dalloway rose from his chair at the VYP table, 64 years old, former Ohio State Senator. A man whose network in this state ran deep enough that half the people in this room owed some portion of their professional existence to a door he had either opened or declined to close. He was not a tall man, but he had the particular quality of filling whatever space he occupied completely. He walked toward us with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who had decided exactly what he was going to do and had no interest in rushing it. He stopped in front of me. I had not seen Prescott Dalloway in person for almost 2 years. He looked older, they all did, everyone did, but his eyes were exactly the same, dark, observant, missing considerably less than most people assumed. He looked at my cake-stained jacket. Then he looked at my face. And then Prescott Dalloway, former state senator, 30-year investor, the most connected man in the room, by a margin that wasn't close, lowered his head in a slow, deliberate bow. Not the perfunctory nod of a business greeting. A real bow. Conscious, intentional, the kind that requires a decision rather than a reflex. "August," he said, his voice carrying to every table within 15 feet without effort. "I owe this man more than most people in this room will ever understand." The jazz band played its last note and stopped. The room went so quiet I could hear a champagne flute being set down 3 tables away. Donovan stood beside me, and I felt rather than saw the way his body reacted, the small involuntary step backward, the sharp intake of breath, the complete structural failure of the composure he had spent the last hour reconstructing. 300 people watched the most powerful investor in the room bow to the old man in the frosting-stained suit. Serena's hand dropped from her throat. Her face had gone the color of the marble floor. I looked at Prescott and felt my throat tighten with the particular overwhelming quality of being seen, truly seen by someone in a room full of people who had spent the evening looking straight through me. "You didn't owe me anything, Press," I said quietly. "You took a chance on my son. That's all I ever asked." "It was more than that," he said firmly, "and you know it." He straightened and turned to look at Donovan with an expression that was not unkind, but was entirely without accommodation. "You should know what kind of man your father is." Donovan's mouth opened. His eyes moved from Prescott to me to Fletcher's briefcase, and I watched the question forming behind his eyes, the one he wasn't ready to ask yet, because he wasn't ready for the answer. Fletcher stepped forward and set the briefcase on the nearest table. He clicked it open with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had waited 31 years for this particular moment. "Mr. Mercer," he said, addressing Donovan with the careful neutrality of a man who was about to change the room's geometry. "There are some things you need to understand about your company." Fletcher Grady did not raise his voice. He never did. That was what made him effective. He delivered the most devastating information in the same unhurried tone most people used to read a grocery list, and somehow the contrast made every word land harder. He laid 3 documents on the nearest table at 9:18 that evening, spreading them with the practiced efficiency of a man who had organized this particular presentation in his head many times over many years. And he looked at Donovan Mercer the way a physician looks at a patient who has been avoiding a diagnosis for considerably longer than was advisable. "These," Fletcher said, "are the founding capitalization records of Mercer and Associates Real Estate Development, ELLC, filed with the Ohio Secretary of State in April of 2009. Donovan's eyes dropped to the documents. His jaw was tight, his arms crossed the body language of a man prepared to argue. "I know my own founding records," he said. "I filed them myself." "You filed the operating agreement," Fletcher said pleasantly. "These are the trust documents that preceded it. Specifically, the August Mercer Family Trust, established February of 2009, which provided the seed capital for your company's formation through a series of layered holding entities." He paused to let that land. "Your father invested $340,000 of his retirement savings. He did it through a trust structure that retained controlling interest 51% at the trust level. You received full operational authority. He retained ultimate ownership control." The room had gone very quiet around us. The investors and partners who had been maintaining the polite fiction of not listening had abandoned that pretense entirely. I could feel 300 people holding their breath. Donovan's arms dropped from his chest. "That's—" He stopped, started again. "That's not possible. I would have known." "The structure was designed so that you wouldn't," Fletcher said. "Not as deception, as protection. Your father's instructions were explicit. You were to have every opportunity to succeed or fail on your own operational decisions. The controlling interest existed as a safeguard, not a leash." Donovan turned to me, and the expression on his face was something I had not seen from him since he was a teenager, raw, unguarded, stripped of every layer of executive polish. His voice cracked at the edges. "Dad, is this true?" My throat tightened. "Every word," I said quietly. You've held controlling interest in my company for 16 years, and you never told me." "I told you I believed in you," I said. "That was the part that mattered." Donovan pressed both hands flat against the table and leaned forward, and I could see the tremor running through his arms. Not anger exactly, something more complicated and more painful than anger. "I built this company," he said, his voice dropping to something raw and urgent. "I made the decisions. I hired the people. I closed the deals." "Yes," I said. "You did. Every one of those things is true. Then what was the point of—" "The point," Prescott Dalloway said from where he stood nearby, his voice carrying that particular senatorial quality of filling a room without effort, "was that your father made it possible for someone to take a chance on you when you had 3 years of track record and a very good business plan." He paused. "I'm that someone. August called me in February of 2012 and told me his son was worth betting on. I trusted his judgment. Your company exists at its current scale because of that phone call." Donovan straightened slowly. His face had gone pale, not the angry pale of a man who feels cheated, but the stunned pale of someone whose entire self-narrative has just been quietly, irrevocably revised. "You called Prescott," he said to me. "The Dalloway partnership, that was you." "I opened a door," I said. "You walked through it. Both things are true simultaneously." One of the senior investors, a man named Preston Hale, who had been with Mercer and Associates for 4 years, and had never, in my observation, shown anything other than polished confidence, leaned forward in his chair, with an expression that had moved decisively past polished into something more direct. "Donovan," Preston said carefully, "did you represent yourself to the board as having built this company independently without undisclosed family investment structures?" Donovan's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "I didn't know," he said. "I genuinely did not know about the trust structure." Preston looked at Vivian. Vivian's expression was professionally neutral in the way that communicated more than emotion would have. "That will be a matter for the board review," she said, "which I am formally initiating as of this evening." Serena stepped forward from where she had been standing, and her voice came out sharp and controlled, the voice of a woman who had decided that offense was her only remaining option. "This is a family matter," she said. "Whatever private financial arrangements exist between August and Donovan, they have no bearing on Ms. Whitmore Mercer." Vivian turned to look at her with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who has encountered this particular argument before. When controlling interest in a registered corporate entity is involved, it is by definition not a family matter. It is a governance matter, and governance is precisely my jurisdiction. Serena's jaw tightened. Her eyes cut to me fast, hot, assessing, and I held her gaze steadily and did not look away. "There's one more thing," Fletcher said, reaching into the briefcase. "In 35 years of structural engineering, the principle I returned to most often was deceptively simple. If you want to know the truth about a structure, watch what it does under load. Not what it looks like on the blueprints. Not what the contractor tells you. What it actually does when the weight comes down. People work the same way." Fletcher removed a single sheet of paper from the briefcase at 9:35 and handed it to Vivian without ceremony. She glanced at it once, then looked toward the production booth at the back of the ballroom, a glassed-in elevated platform where 2 technicians had been managing the evening's audio and visual elements. "Excuse me," Vivian said, her voice pitched to carry clearly without requiring volume. "I need the stage camera footage from this evening beginning at approximately 7:40 p.m. Full playback on the main screen, please." The senior technician, a young woman with short red hair and the expression of someone who had just realized her Friday night was about to become considerably more complicated, looked at Donovan. Donovan said nothing. His face had not recovered from what Fletcher had told him 4 minutes ago, and he did not appear to have the resources available to mount an objection. Vivian looked at the technician patiently. "Yes, ma'am," the technician said, and turned back to her board. The LED screen above the stage, the same screen that had broadcast my fall in crisp high definition 2 hours earlier, flickered, went dark for 3 seconds, and then filled with the time-stamped display of the stage camera recording. 7:41 p.m. The ballroom before the incident, seen from the camera position at stage, left the cake centered in frame, the podium to the right, the main floor spreading out beyond. The room's ambient noise died completely. 300 people turned toward the screen with the focused collective attention of an audience that understands something important is about to happen. I watched from where I stood near the table, and I did not need to watch the screen. I had been there. I knew what the footage contained. Instead, I watched faces. I watched Prescott Dalloway's expression settle into the grave, still quality of a man confirming what he had suspected. I watched Preston Hale lean slowly back in his chair, arms crossing, the body language of someone revising a significant assumption. I watched Donovan's face as the footage reached 7:44, the moment Serena and I crossed the stage left area together, her hand on my arm, her posture warm and attentive, and entirely performed. The camera angle caught it cleanly. From this perspective, from stage left looking inward, you could see Serena's left foot, clearly the deliberate outward extension, precisely timed, precisely placed. There was no ambiguity in the image, no possible interpretation that accommodated accident. The foot moved with intention, the way trained eyes recognize intention. In a load-bearing calculation, the geometry was too exact for chance. A sound moved through the room. Not quite a gasp, more the collective exhalation of 300 people arriving simultaneously at an uncomfortable understanding. That's... Donovan's voice broke off. His hand came up and pressed hard against his mouth. His eyes were fixed on the screen with an expression of raw physical horror, the look of a man watching something he cannot unsee and knows he will be seeing for a very long time. That's not... He turned to Serena. Tell me that's not what it looks like. Serena's chin came up. Her eyes were bright and hard, and she held herself with the rigid composure of someone who has decided that composure is the only weapon left. Donovan, tell me, he said, and his voice had gone rough and low in a way I had not heard from him since the night I told him his mother was gone. Tell me right now that it's not what it looks like. Serena held his gaze for 2 seconds. 3. Her jaw worked once. She did not tell him. The silence she offered instead was its own answer, and it landed in Donovan's chest, visibly. I saw it go in, saw his shoulders drop 2 inches, saw the color leave his face entirely, until he looked suddenly much younger and much older at the same time. His eyes went red at the rims, and he pressed his lips together, hard, fighting something that was trying to surface. August. Prescott's voice was quiet and direct. I want to say clearly for this room that what I just watched was a deliberate act, and that the man on the receiving end of it has more integrity in that old suit than anyone in this room who laughed. Several of the junior associates near the back looked sharply at the floor. The 2 investors who had smirked during my fall were now studying their wine glasses with extraordinary concentration. Serena turned to face me directly. Her voice dropped all pretense of warmth, all social performance stripped down to something harder and more honest than anything she had said all evening. You knew the camera was running, she said. You knew it would catch it. I looked at my daughter-in-law, at this woman who had spent the better part of a decade building walls between my son and the life he came from, and I felt no satisfaction. Only the deep, settled tiredness of something long overdue finally arriving. I didn't need to know, I said. Honest men don't have to think about cameras. Serena's nostrils flared. Her composure cracked just at the edges, just enough to show what was underneath. Not remorse, not fear exactly, but the specific, cold fury of someone whose plan has been dismantled by a variable they failed to account for. You planned this entire evening, she said, her voice rising slightly, despite her visible effort to control it. From the beginning. The lawyer, the board chair, all of it. Serena. Fletcher's voice was mild and entirely implacable. I'd advise you very strongly to stop speaking without counsel present. She turned on him. Don't, Ms. Whitmore Mercer. Vivian stepped forward, and something in her posture, some quality of complete grounded authority stopped Serena mid-sentence. "There is a second folder," Vivian said. "I think it's time we discussed what's in it." Fletcher reached into the briefcase again, and Donovan, who had not moved from where he stood, looked at me across the table with eyes that were red and wet and devastated, and said in a voice so quiet I almost missed it beneath the noise of the room, "Dad, what else don't I know?" Fletcher reached into the briefcase for the second time at 9:48, and the folder he produced was thicker than the first, more pages, more tabs, more of the color-coded organization that told me he had been building this particular file for considerably longer than one evening. 18 months ago, Fletcher said, his voice carrying the same level, unhurried quality it had maintained all evening. Ms. Whitmore Mercer retained two separate attorneys, one in Columbus, one in Cleveland, to explore the legal mechanisms available for challenging a trust beneficiary's controlling interest on grounds of diminished mental capacity. The room reacted. Not loudly, the crowd was too sophisticated for loud, but in the specific way of people who have just heard something that reorders everything they thought they understood about the evening. Donovan's head turned slowly toward Serena. The motion had a terrible deliberateness to it, like a man turning to look at something he already knows is going to hurt. "Diminished mental capacity," Fletcher continued, "is a legal standard under Ohio law that, if established through medical evaluation and documented behavioral evidence, can be used to petition a court for removal of a person's authority to control assets held in trust. It is a legitimate legal mechanism. It is also, in this instance, the framework Ms. Whitmore Mercer has been constructing around your father for the past year and a half." Preston Hale leaned forward in his chair, his face stripped of its earlier professional composure. "Are you saying she was building a case to have August declared incompetent?" "That is precisely what I'm saying," Fletcher replied. Serena's chin lifted. Her voice came out sharp and clipped, every word bitten off cleanly. "That is a grotesque mischaracterization of a private legal consultation. The consultation wasn't private. After the second attorney involved decided the arrangement presented ethical concerns and documented it accordingly," Fletcher said. He removed a 2-page letter from the folder and set it on the table. "This is his written account, dated 14 months ago." Serena's composure cracked, not collapsed, cracked, a hairline fracture running through the surface that her training almost managed to conceal. Almost. Her hands, which had been perfectly still at her sides, closed into fists so tight that her knuckles went bone white. Donovan made a sound. Not words, a sound low and involuntary, the kind a person makes when something hits them in the chest before they can brace for it. His eyes were fixed on Serena, and they were filling fast, not from sadness, but from the specific anguish of a man watching a version of his life dissolve in real time. "The party tonight," Vivian said, her voice measured and precise, "was intended as the final step. The footage of your father falling, which Ms. Whitmore Mercer arranged, was meant to serve as documented behavioral evidence. An elderly man causing a scene at a formal corporate event, losing physical control, creating disruption." She paused. "The kind of footage that, edited and contextualized appropriately, could support a petition for mental incapacity review." "She knew the camera was running," Prescott said. His voice had gone very cold. "She counted on it." "What she didn't account for," Fletcher said, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had placed a chess piece 31 years ago and waited for this exact moment, was the second camera. Stage right crew positioning camera. Different angle. Caught her giving the signal. He produced still frames from the folder, printed clear, unambiguous. The stage right camera captured Serena's foot from a second angle. The timing, the placement, the deliberateness of it from this position, there is no interpretation available that accommodates accident. The still frames went onto the table. Donovan looked at them for exactly 2 seconds before looking away, his jaw working violently, his eyes squeezing shut. A tear escaped down his left cheek, and he pressed the back of his hand against his mouth so hard his knuckles went white. "Donovan." Serena's voice shifted, the calculation dropping out of it, something more urgent and more real taking its place. "Everything I did was to protect what we built. You have to understand that. The old man was always going to be a liability to—" "Don't." Donovan's voice came out broken and barely above a whisper. "Don't call him that. I was protecting our future. You were protecting your position." His voice fractured completely on the last word. He turned away from her physically, turned his body away, a gesture so final and so visible that 300 people saw it happen simultaneously. Serena's breath caught audibly. For the first time all evening, she looked not calculating, but genuinely afraid. Vivienne turned to her with the calm authority of someone closing a door. "Ms. Whitmore Mercer, I am going to strongly recommend for the final time that you retain legal counsel before saying another word in this room." Fletcher was already reaching into the briefcase a third time. "There is one more thing," he said, "and this one isn't about the company." I had written it on a Tuesday afternoon in November of 2020, sitting at the drafting table in my study on Callaway Street, while Eleanor's hydrangeas stood bare in the backyard, and the Ohio sky pressed its gray winter weight against the window. I had written it because Donovan had come to a client dinner that year and introduced me to his partners as my father. He's retired, not August Mercer, not Dad, not any of the versions of me that had existed before retirement, made me convenient to summarize. I had driven home from Columbus that evening and sat at the drafting table for a long time, and then I had picked up a pen. Fletcher removed the envelope at 10:05 and held it out to Donovan. White envelope sealed Donovan's name written on the front in my handwriting, the careful, deliberate handwriting of an engineer who had learned early that unclear notation caused expensive mistakes. "Your father gave me this 5 years ago," Fletcher said quietly. "He asked me to hold it until the time was right." Donovan took the envelope with both hands. His fingers were trembling, not slightly, but visibly, the fine tremor of someone operating at the outer edge of what they can hold together. He turned it over once, looking at his own name in my handwriting, and something in his face crumpled so fast and so completely that he had to press his lips together hard to keep it contained. "Do you want privacy?" Vivienne asked. Donovan shook his head, a single unsteady motion. He broke the seal with his thumb and removed 2 pages of lined paper folded in thirds, the kind that came from the yellow legal pad I kept on the drafting table. He read it once through to himself. I watched his face while he read, because I had written those words, and I knew where each one would land, and watching them arrive in him was one of the most painful things I had ever willingly done. His chin began to tremble by the second paragraph. By the end of the first page, his eyes were so full that the tears spilled over, whether he wanted them to or not, down both cheeks simultaneously, quiet and unstoppable. The tears of a man who has run out of the resources required to hold them back. Preston Hale, who had been watching from his seat, said quietly, "Read it out loud." Donovan looked up at him. Then he looked at me. His throat moved in a hard swallow, and then, with the particular courage of someone who understands that a thing witnessed by many carries more weight than a thing kept private, he unfolded the pages and began to read in a voice that shook from the first word and kept going anyway. "Donovan, if you're reading this, it means I was wrong to believe that time alone would be enough. I'm not writing this to punish you. I'm writing it because I have been keeping a promise to your mother for years now, and promises have a way of running out. I never needed you to remember every sacrifice. That's not what sacrifice is for. What I needed, what I still need, is for you to remember this. A man's worth is not the square footage of his office or the label on his suit. I know you know that. I raised you to know it. What I don't know anymore is whether you still believe it. The day you treat another human being as less than human because of what they wear or what they drive or where they come from, That's the day you've lost something that no amount of money will ever buy back. I love you. Not the version of you that closes real estate deals or appears in business publications. The boy who fell asleep on my shoulder on long drives home from Little League. The young man who cried at his mother's funeral without apologizing for it. That person is worth any amount of waiting. I hope when you read this that you agree. Dad, November 14th, 2020. The ballroom was completely and absolutely quiet. Donovan lowered the pages. His face was wet, and he made no move to address it. No hand raised to his cheek. No controlled recovery. He simply stood in the middle of his year-end party with his father's words in his hands and let the room see exactly what those words had done to him. Piper had moved from her table at some point during the reading. She was standing 20 feet away, her small hands clasped together in front of her navy dress, her face carrying an expression far too old. For 10 years old, the expression of a child who loves two people and has been watching them hurt each other and is desperately hoping this is the moment it stops. Donovan looked at his daughter. His voice came out destroyed and barely audible. Piper, sweetheart. She crossed the 20 feet at a run and hit him around the middle with both arms, and Donovan Mercer, CEO, 43 years old, master of the controlled impression, bent over his daughter and cried in a way that had nothing managed about it at all. My throat had closed so completely I couldn't have spoken if I'd wanted to. I looked down at Eleanor's handkerchief in my hand and thought, Ellie, I think this might be what watching over him looks like. The clock on the far wall of the Grand Meridian's main ballroom read 10:22 when the LED screen finally went dark. 300 people sat without moving, without speaking, without so much as reaching for their water glasses. The footage had ended 30 seconds ago, but nobody seemed to know that the moment was over because it wasn't over. It was still happening, still spreading through the room the way a crack spreads through ice, quiet and unstoppable and terrifying in its patience. I stood near the edge of the stage, my knees still throbbing beneath the stiff fabric of my old tweed suit. Frosting had dried in the crease of my left sleeve, white and cracked like old paint on a barn wall. Fletcher stood 2 steps to my right, his briefcase closed now, both hands folded over the latch. Vivian Ashworth remained at the podium, her spine perfectly straight, her eyes sweeping the room, the way a lighthouse sweeps a dark harbor, steady, merciful to no one. Donovan stood center stage. I watched my son's shoulders rise and fall once-twice like a man surfacing after being underwater too long. His jacket was unbuttoned. His tie hung loose. He looked for the first time in years exactly like the boy who used to crawl into my workshop at midnight afraid of thunderstorms, asking me to keep the light on. Serena stood 3 feet to his left, her jaw set like granite, her fingers wrapped around her clutch bag so tightly the knuckles had gone bloodless. She kept her eyes forward. She did not look at Donovan. She did not look at me. She stared at a point somewhere past the back wall, as though she could will herself out of the room through sheer refusal to acknowledge it. Vivian's voice broke through the held breath of the room. Mr. Mercer. She was addressing Donovan. The board requires a response. Not tomorrow, not through council, now. Donovan's throat moved a hard swallow. He pressed his fingers to his temple and dragged them slowly down his jaw. Then he looked at Serena. Serena. His voice came out rougher than I expected. Tell me Fletcher's wrong. Tell me the footage is wrong. Tell me there's an explanation I'm missing. Serena's chin lifted a fraction. Don't do this here, Donovan. I'm asking you a question. His voice cracked on the last word, and he cleared his throat hard like he was trying to shove the emotion back down where it couldn't embarrass him. In front of 300 people, in front of my father, I'm asking you directly. Did you plan that? The cake? Did you tell them to root him that way? Did you set it up? The room didn't move. I didn't move. My chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with the fall. It felt like watching a house burn down, a house you built with your own hands, and knowing water won't save it anymore. Serena's voice dropped low and controlled. You're making a scene. You made the scene. Donovan's voice rose, not in anger, not yet, but in something raw. Grief, maybe. Something he hadn't had words for until this exact moment. You made the scene the second you decided my father's humiliation was a business strategy. Your father, she said, and the word came out clipped, surgical, has never understood what it takes to operate at this level. He doesn't belong in rooms like this. I protected the brand. I protected you. I heard Piper make a sharp sound from where she stood near Prescott Dalloway's table, a short, wounded noise like someone had pressed a thumb into a bruise. Prescott put a steady hand on her shoulder. She pressed her face briefly into his jacket sleeve, and her small shoulders shook. My eyes burned. I blinked hard twice and forced myself to keep breathing. Donovan stared at Serena. His jaw worked. I could see the muscle jumping near his ear the same way it had when he was 16 and trying not to cry at his mother's hospital bedside. He used to fight tears the same way I did, jaw-tight eyes up, breathe through the nose. Do you love me? He asked. The room went electric. Someone near the back shifted in their chair. The sound carried like a dropped pin in the silence. Serena's expression fractured just for a second, just a hairline crack before she reassembled it. That's not a fair question right now. It's the only question. Donovan's voice dropped to something almost private, though 300 people heard every word. Everything else, the trust, the shares, the footage, that's legal. That's for the board. But I'm asking you as your husband. Do you love me, or did you love what you thought I was going to become? Serena opened her mouth, closed it. Her eyes finally moved down to the floor, to the polished marble that reflected the chandeliers back at us in broken gold pieces. She didn't answer, and that non-answer answered everything. Donovan exhaled, long, shaking, audible across the whole room. He reached up and touched the knot of his tie, then dropped his hand. He turned away from Serena. He turned toward me. I didn't know what my face looked like. My eyes were hot and stinging. My hands were steady. I'd made sure of that, but my chest felt like something inside it had finally quietly given way. Donovan walked to the edge of the stage. He stepped down without the stairs landing hard on both feet and crossed the floor toward me. 300 people watched him cross that floor, and he didn't look at a single one of them. He stopped in front of me. Up close, I could see his eyes were red-rimmed, his jaw trembling with the effort of holding himself together. Dad, I didn't know about any of it. His voice came out barely above a whisper. The trust, the money, I swear to God, I didn't know. I reached out and put my hand on his shoulder. I know you didn't, son. I should have protected you tonight. His voice broke. He pressed his fist against his mouth for a moment, breathing hard through his nose. I should have stood up the second she... Donovan. I squeezed his shoulder once. Stand beside me. That's all I need from you right now. Just stand beside me. He looked at me for a long moment, eyes wet and blazing. Then he stepped to my left. Above us, Vivian Ashworth cleared her throat. Ladies and gentlemen, Fletcher Grady has one final document to present. Fletcher reached into his briefcase, and whatever came next, I already knew it would change every remaining thing. By 10:45 that night, the Grand Meridian's ballroom had become a different kind of room entirely, not the room Serena had designed, not the room with curated seats and a 3-tier cake and a guest list built to make Donovan look like a man who had built something from nothing. That room was gone. What remained in its place was rawer, quieter, and far more honest. Fletcher reached into his briefcase and withdrew a single document, dark blue cover, gold embossed seal at the top. I recognized it the moment I saw it. I'd signed it 16 years ago on a Tuesday morning in February, sitting across from Fletcher in his Columbus office while Eleanor waited downstairs in the car with a thermos of coffee and an unfinished crossword puzzle folded into her coat pocket. She always saved the unfinished ones. She never got back to them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Fletcher addressed the room, his courtroom voice carrying to every corner without effort. "What I'm holding is a certified copy of the August Mercer Family Trust, established February 14, 2009 under Ohio, Revised Code Section 5808. This document names August Warren Mercer as sole grantor and primary trustee, holding a 51% controlling interest in all entities under the Mercer and Associates umbrella. Under its terms, no executive decision, no CEO appointment, no capital restructuring, no dissolution of assets can be executed without the trustee's written consent." He paused and let that number sit in the room, 51%. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full-packed, dense, with 300 people recalculating everything they thought they understood about this company, this family, this evening. Vivian stepped to the podium. "To be precise, Mr. August Mercer is not a guest tonight. He is under Ohio corporate law, the controlling principle of this company. Every contract, every partnership, every capital commitment represented in this room carries his authority." Her gaze moved slowly across the tables. "Everyone who watched what happened to him at 7:45 this evening should understand that very clearly." Prescott Dalloway rose from his chair. 64 years old, former Ohio State Senator, a man who had shaken hands in far more powerful rooms than this one. He stood deliberately, buttoned his jacket, and turned toward me. Then he bowed, not a nod, not a polite tilt of the head, but a genuine bow. The kind you gave a man you had underestimated and were publicly correcting the record on. "Mr. Mercer," Prescott said clearly, "I owe you an apology. We all do." My throat closed up. I pressed my back molars together and breathed through my nose and held myself still. I thought of Eleanor the way she used to grip my hand in church when something moved her too deeply to sit straight. "Hold it together, Gus." I could almost hear her. Serena's voice cut in from the left side of the stage, sharp and controlled, but carrying a fracture in it now. "This is premature. The trust hasn't been independently authenticated tonight. You're making governance decisions based on one party's documents without. The trust carries a certified notary seal from Franklin County dated February 14, 2009. Fletcher said, polite and iron. "Filed with the Ohio Secretary of State's office as a statutory business trust. I filed it myself. If you want to challenge its validity, Monday's board session is precisely the place for that." "And the footage?" Serena's jaw was tight. "You cannot use hotel security footage to support a corporate. We're not using it in a governance proceeding tonight." Vivian cut her off without heat or hesitation. "We're using it to establish context. The board will determine additional steps." She paused just long enough to make the next sentence land. "I would strongly advise you, Ms. Whitmore Mercer, to retain your own counsel before Monday." The color drained from Serena's face, not all at once, but gradually, like a tide pulling back from a shoreline and leaving something cold and exposed behind. Donovan's hand found my arm. He gripped it the way a man grips something when he's afraid of what happens if he lets go. "Dad." His voice was barely holding together. "Why didn't you tell me all these years? Why did you let me think I built it alone?" I turned to look at my son. His eyes were red-rimmed. He looked so much like the 27-year-old kid who'd sat at my kitchen table in 2009 with a business plan printed on copy paper and a dream 3 sizes too big for his bank account. "Because you did build it," I told him. "The money was mine. The work was yours. I didn't want you looking over your shoulder wondering if you'd earned it. I wanted you to know you'd earned it." His face crumpled. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth hard. His shoulders shook once, one involuntary shudder. He fought down with everything he had. When his eyes opened again, they were wet and blazing. "I'm so sorry, Dad." His voice broke on the last word. "Tonight what I said, what I let her do." "I know," I said. I put my hand on the back of his neck the way I used to when he was small and the thunder was too loud. I know you are. Piper pushed through the crowd and wrapped both arms around my waist, pressing her face into my frosting-stained jacket, her small shoulders trembling. "Grandpa," she said, muffled against the old tweed. "Are you okay?" I pulled her close and pressed my mouth to the top of her head. My eyes were stinging fiercely, and I stopped fighting it. "Yeah, baby girl," I said, voice rougher than I meant. "I'm okay." Donovan put his hand on my shoulder. His expression held grief and gratitude and shame and love all at once, fighting each other for the same small space. "What do we do now?" he asked. I covered his hand with mine, my knuckles old and scarred and loose the way hands get after 70 years of hard use. Now I said, "We go home." The lobby of the Grand Meridian was nearly empty by 11:15 that night, when Donovan found me sitting on a bench near the revolving doors, my old tweed jacket folded across my knees, my cracked phone in my hand. I hadn't called anyone. I'd just been sitting there watching the December wind push dead leaves across the lit-up entrance outside, thinking about Eleanor, and how she used to say that the hardest nights always looked prettiest from the inside of somewhere warm. Donovan sat down beside me without asking. He loosened what remained of his tie and dragged both hands through his hair. He looked like a man who had just walked out of a building that collapsed behind him. "Fletcher says Serena's lawyer called," he said, 20 minutes ago. "I know." I'd spoken to Fletcher briefly in the hallway. "Fletcher handled it. She's going to contest the board's authority to suspend my executive rights." Donovan's jaw tightened. "She's going to claim the trust documentation is procedurally invalid because it was presented without advance notice to the CEO. She can claim whatever she wants," I said. "Fletcher filed that trust with the Secretary of State's office in March of 2009. It's been sitting in a public record for 16 years. Her lawyer will find that out on Monday and save everyone a lot of time." Donovan rubbed his face with both hands, pressing hard against his eye sockets, like he was trying to push something back inside. His voice came out muffled and raw. "She told me she did it for us. That's what she said tonight in the car before I told her to get out. She said she did all of it, the party, the seating, routing, the cart past you. She said she did it to protect our future, that you were a liability." He dropped his hands. His eyes were red and furious. "She called my father a liability." My chest tightened. I kept my voice even. "What did you say to that?" "I told her to get out of the car." He exhaled hard through his nose. "She took a cab. I don't know where she went, and right now I don't care." He turned to look at me, and the expression on his face hit me somewhere behind the sternum, shame and grief, and a desperate kind of honesty that I hadn't seen from him in years. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." "Go ahead." "Did you know she was going to do something tonight before it happened?" I looked at my son. "Fletcher warned me 3 weeks ago that something felt wrong with the invitation. I didn't know the specifics. I came anyway." "Why?" His voice cracked. "If you thought something was wrong, why would you come and walk straight into it?" "Because you're my son." I said it simply the way I'd have said the sky was blue or the coffee was hot. Because if there was any chance it was just a party, and I stayed home out of suspicion, I'd never have forgiven myself. And because I stopped for a moment, steadied myself, because I wanted to see Piper. Donovan made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. He pressed his fist against his mouth and breathed through his nose, his shoulders rigid with the effort of holding himself together. His free hand reached across and gripped my forearm tight, like a man grabbing a railing. "I should have called you more," he said, voice thick. "This past year I told myself you were fine in Dayton. I told myself you liked the quiet. Truth is, it was easier not to see how far I'd drifted." "Donovan." I put my hand over his. "Look at me." He looked up. His eyes were glassy and bright, and so much like Eleanor's when she was trying not to cry that my own throat ached. "You drifted," I said. "Men do. Doesn't mean you're gone. I tightened my grip on his hand. You crossed that floor tonight. You stood beside me. That's the part I'm going to remember. He exhaled long and shaking, and full of 16 years of unsaid things, and his shoulders finally came down from around his ears. What happens Monday? He asked. Monday the board meets. Vivian will chair it. Fletcher will present the trust in full. Your executive suspension will likely be lifted within 60 days once the governance review is complete, provided you cooperate fully. I watched his face. The question isn't what happens Monday. The question is what you decide between now and then. He straightened, wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand. I'm deciding right now. His voice was steadier than I'd heard it all evening. I'm done letting her make decisions I should be making. I'm done going quiet when I should be speaking up. He looked at me directly. Starting with calling you, tonight, after we leave here. You can call me from the car, I said. I'll be awake. He nodded once, sharp, definitive, the same nod he'd given me on the ballroom floor an hour ago. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and held out his hand. I took it. Let him pull me to my feet. My knee protested, and I steadied myself against the bench for just a second, and Donovan kept hold of my hand until I had my balance. You drive safe back to Dayton, he said. I always do. I picked up my jacket. Ford F-150s don't break down. They just get more honest with age. Donovan laughed, a real one this time, brief and rough and genuine, and the sound of it was the best thing I'd heard all night. 4 days after the Grand Meridian, on the morning of December 23rd, I was standing at my kitchen counter in Dayton, pouring my second cup of coffee, the good kind dark roast, the kind Eleanor used to say smelled like a real morning, when I heard the sound of tires crunching slow and deliberate across the gravel driveway. I set the mug down. My hand was steadier than it had been in days. I looked out the window above the sink, the one that faced the front yard, the one Eleanor used to lean against every morning in her housecoat, coffee in hand, checking on her hydrangeas like they were children she was responsible for. The hydrangeas were bare now, brown and skeletal in the December cold, stripped down to their bones, the way Ohio winters stripped everything eventually. But I'd wrapped the bases with burlap the way she'd shown me 20 years ago, pressing my thumbs into the knots, the way she pressed hers, and I expected they'd come back in April the same as always. They always did. Eleanor had chosen them specifically because they were tough. Donovan's car, his personal one, not the company Audi with the Mercer and Associates plate on the front, pulled up and stopped just short of the garage door. The engine cut. A beat of quiet. Then the rear door swung open before the car had even fully settled on its wheels. Piper came flying out of the back seat at a dead sprint, her sneakers scattering gravel, her winter coat unzipped and flapping wide behind her, like she'd decided somewhere on the drive from Columbus that cold weather was a suggestion she wasn't interested in following. "Grandpa!" she hollered full volume, the kind of holler that carries down the whole block and makes neighbors look up from their morning papers. I pushed through the front door, and she hit me like a small freight train, both arms locking around my waist, her face buried hard into my flannel shirt. I wrapped my arms around her and held on, and didn't pretend, not even for a second, that my eyes weren't going hot and blurring immediately. I blinked hard and pressed my cheek against the top of her head and breathed in the scent of her shampoo, strawberries bright and clean and 10 years old, and something that had been wound tight in my chest since Friday night. Something I hadn't even realized I was still carrying finally began to come loose. "Hey, baby girl." I managed my voice rougher than I intended. "You're going to knock me clean off this porch." She pulled back just far enough to look up at me, her eyes fierce and bright and suspiciously wet at the corners. "Good," she said. "You need somebody to knock you around a little. You've been out here alone too long, and it's not okay. And I told Dad that on the way here, and I'm telling you now." I laughed. It came out fuller and rougher than I expected, more laughter than I'd produced in months, honest laughter, the kind that starts in your chest and surprises you on the way out. And I pulled her back in and pressed my hand against the back of her head and just let it happen. "You told him that," I said. "Twice," she said, still holding on. He agreed both times. Donovan came up the porch steps with both hands deep in his jacket pockets, his shoulders slightly rounded against the December cold. He looked different than he had Friday night at the Grand Meridian. Not fixed, nothing broken across decades gets fixed in 4 days. And I'd lived long enough to stop expecting miracles on that kind of timeline, but lighter. Like he'd finally set something down that he'd been carrying in the wrong position for years, something that had been pulling at his spine without him quite noticing, until the moment he put it on the ground. He stopped at the top step, looked at me over Piper's head. "I should have come sooner," he said. His voice was quiet and carried no performance in it whatsoever. "Not just this week. I mean years ago, Dad. I should have been driving up this driveway a lot more than I was." "You're here now," I said. "That counts for more than you think." He exhaled slow, unsteady, and stepped forward. I reached out with my free arm and pulled him in, Piper still tucked against my right side, and for a moment the three of us stood together on that old wooden porch in the gray December cold, and I held my son and my granddaughter, and I didn't say a single word, because some moments don't need language. They just need weight. They just need presence. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about how she used to stand in this exact doorway on Sunday mornings, this same threshold, this same worn wood under her slippers, waiting for Donovan to pull up after a long drive back from college. How she'd leave the porch light burning, even if he wasn't due until well past midnight. "He needs to see it from the driveway," she'd say, when I suggested turning it off and saving the bulb. "He needs to know somebody's still up. He needs to know this is still his home." I'd left the porch light on every single night since the day we buried her. 8 years of mornings where I'd wake up and see it still glowing in the pale dawn light and think old habit. 8 years of telling myself it was just habit. But standing here now with both of them pressed against me, I understood it had never been habit at all. Donovan pulled back first. His eyes were wet, and he wasn't fighting it anymore. The jaw wasn't tight. The throat wasn't working against itself. He let it be what it was. "Fletcher called this morning," he said. "Board confirmed Monday's emergency session. Vivian says the suspension review should wrap up by mid-January, assuming full cooperation on my end." He paused, dragged a breath. "And Serena's attorney reached out. She's not contesting the board's findings. They're moving forward with a separation agreement." "Okay," I said. He blinked. "Okay, Dad, that's significant. That means she's—" "I know what it means." I put my hand firmly on his shoulder and felt him steady under it. "And we'll face all of it. Every piece of it together the right way, one Monday at a time." I looked down at Piper, who had pulled back just far enough to look up at me with Eleanor's eyes, same shape, same particular shade of brown, same expression of someone who understood more than she was saying. "But right now what I have is hot coffee on the counter, and there's a tin of your grandmother's snickerdoodles in the back of the freezer that I've been saving since last December, because I couldn't bring myself to eat them alone." Piper's whole face transformed. The worry dissolved and something pure and uncomplicated took its place, a grin so wide it scrunched the bridge of her nose and pushed up into her eyes. "Grandma's snickerdoodles," she said, already moving. "The very ones. She made 3 dozen the December before she passed, and I froze them, and I have been guarding them like they were classified documents." Piper grabbed my hand with both of hers and started pulling me toward the kitchen door with the full conviction of a 10-year-old who has decided exactly where she needs to be. I let her pull me. I let her set the pace and lead the way, and I followed her through the door and into the warmth of the kitchen, where the coffee was still hot and the windows were fogged at the edges from the cold outside. Donovan stepped in behind us and held the door. As I crossed the threshold, I reached over with my free hand and clicked off the porch light. The morning was full and gray and quiet and lit from the inside. Everybody was home. We didn't need it anymore. That morning on the porch, with Piper's hand in mine and Donovan's shoulder against the doorframe, I understood something I wish I'd learned 30 years earlier. Love isn't loud. Now doesn't announce itself at dinner parties or demand a seat at the head of the table. It shows up at 7:45 on a Friday night and gets back on its feet after falling into a cake, because that's what love does. It keeps standing. I've told you a grandpa story's worth telling, not because I was brave, but because I wasn't. For too many years, I stayed quiet, kept the trust papers hidden, watched from a distance, and told myself that giving Donovan space meant giving him freedom. It didn't. It meant he drifted until a wall stopped him. Don't do what I did. If you love someone, show up messy, imperfect, in a 20-year-old JCPenney suit if you have to. Show up before the cake falls. This family story taught me that money can build a company, but only honesty can build a home. And I believe with everything I have left in these 71-year-old bones that God doesn't let the wrong people win forever. He just makes you wait long enough to appreciate the moment when they don't. Every grandpa stories has a porch light in it somewhere. Every family story has a door that stayed open 1 minute longer than it should have. This was mine. If this family story moved something in you, if it reminded you of your own father, your own silence, your own porch light left burning, leave a comment below and tell me. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more grandpa stories that stay with you long after they end, subscribe, because I'm just getting started. Thank you for staying until the very last word. It means more than you know. A gentle note. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely for storytelling and reflection. If that's not your cup of tea, no hard feelings. Step away and find what serves you best. But if you're staying, welcome. The best ones are still coming.